everybody, to the last collecting track panel of the day, and one that has typically been one of the most well-attended and most popular in recent times. In fact, we're at capacity, so congrats on making it in. If you have attended before the other panels, you know we're giving away a Star Tot, and we will do that at the end of the panel. There'll be 2 exits, and we ask that you exit calmly in a single file line, and you will be able to get one. If you are looking for the others that you may not have received, tomorrow after the last panel ends around 4:45, 5 o'clock, we will be giving away all of our extras, so make sure to come then. We'll have a line, and you'll be able to go through and pick out one that you haven't gotten, get back in line, and get the other ones. But you're here today for the original props and costumes, and like I said, this has been one of the most well-attended panels, and for good reason, because sitting before you are 5 of the world's foremost experts in the field, and they have some special surprises for you today. So please give a warm welcome to Brandon Allinger, Andy Goulding, Stephen Lane, Gus Lopez, and Tom Spina.
Can you hear us? Yeah, it works.
Hey, what do you know?
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
So thanks, everybody, for turning up today. Nice to see you. Just out of interest, how many of you guys have attended a prop panel before?
Fair number.
Reasonable
Good.
number. Yeah, but there's quite a few that haven't, so unfortunately our plan of just leaving you here and going to the bar isn't going to work. So we'll just start off with introducing each of ourselves so you kind of know who we are. So my name's Andy. I've been collecting toys since the 70s. I've been collecting props since the late 80s. I own an engineering company, and I started out doing a little bit of work in the entertainment industry. So I first started out with Rover Group working on the movie Judge Dredd, the Sylvester Stallone one, not the good one. So that kind of got me into knowing that these things were available, and then I met a lot of these guys, and we kind of started on our track of collecting props, and a lot of us still working in around the industry today. So I will hand you over to our next presenter.
Hi everybody, my name is Stephen Lane. I'm CEO and founder of Prop Store. I've been collecting props for close to 30 years now. The gateway for me was vintage toys, so I was sort of finding small props and costume pieces at some of the collectors' fairs in the UK, really back before there was anywhere to go and buy these items. And it was there that I found some of the real sort of inspirational pieces that drove me on to do this for not only a hobby for a number of years, but subsequently my living.
Hey everybody, I'm Tom Spina. I have 2 companies, Tom Spina Designs and Regal Robot. I've also been collecting forever. I got my start through Don Post masks and replica props. I, as a kid, was just obsessed with rubber monsters and things like that in movies, and Don Post was the only person out there, or the only place out there, where you could get really good-looking rubber masks, and I wanted to make my own, so I learned how to make my own masks. I got into sculpting creature characters and cantina monsters and all of that, and eventually got to do that for a living. My company does everything from restoring original props to creating them for commercials and TV, and then with Regal Robot, we picked up the license with Lucasfilm after working with them for so long, where now we do furniture, art, and decor in a real sculptural cool style, and we've just added life-size characters and creatures. So if any of you like to collect one-to-one statues, one-to-one busts, that's all stuff we can do, and including custom stuff. So if someone has like a weird character they've always loved, but you're never going to see some company make 1,000 of it, we're the company that'll make one just for you.
Hi everyone, I am Brandon Allinger. I'm also part of Prop Store. I've been collecting original props and costumes for a number of years. I sort of got started on it similar to Tom with replica props, building replica lightsabers, things like that out of the Graflex 3 cells, and then there's a big moment for me where I started visiting filming locations and went to some of the locations after people like Mr. Lopez next to me here, and found original pieces, parts of the sets from Star Wars and from the prequels and from Raiders out in Tunisia, and that kind of set me on my journey to try to track down these little pieces.
My name is Gus Lopez. I collect Star Wars items in a few categories, but one of my favorite categories is original movie props, special effects models, costumes. In terms of like occupying space in our house, that's the #1 category. Like half of our house is really to display props. And my gateway drug into this area was visiting the filming locations, similar to Brandon, is visiting the actual places where they filmed Star Wars, and picking up set dressing from stuff they left behind was sort of my entry into this space.
And by the way, yes, we did go out of our way to find the maddest pictures of ourselves we could for the panel.
I did the PowerPoint, so I wanted to have a little bit of fun with it.
Thanks,
So-
Brandon.
So just to tell you guys a bit about the panel format today, it's going to be a little atypical. We figured that there would be a number of people here who had seen us talk in the past, and so rather than sort of going through an overview of the basics of collecting, the basics of props, and things like that, we want to try to make it as interactive as we possibly can, and we want to have people in the audience ask questions. So we're encouraging you guys to ask questions. We actually need you to ask questions, and if you don't have any questions to ask, then it's going to be a very boring panel.
We're just going to sit in silence until you get your star tots.
Yeah. So as a little incentive beyond the star tots, we have these Harry Lang auction catalogs. So Harry Lang was an art director on the first Star Wars film, and we actually have an auction running right now on propstore.com for a number of his original sketches. And all those are printed in this full-color auction catalog that we brought here. So anybody that asks a question today is going to get a copy of the Harry Lang auction catalog. And our friend and guest moderator, Mr. Jim Mossy, is going to roam the crowd here. You'll see him there in the Imperial officer cap. Don't worry, he's a nice guy. And if you have a question, put your hand up. He'll come find you. And
And by the
Get
way,
into it.
even though we have English accents, no questions about Brexit. We don't understand it either.
I was going to say, can I ask a question?
What was the first thing you collected? Like real, prop, something from a movie or something like that.
It's his fault. I had a screen-used Death Star piece. I'm sorry, was this Gus specific or for all of us? Oh, cool. So a screen-used Death Star piece and a screen-used Banquet Beetle from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and that Banquet Beetle came from you, and those came right around the same time. So those were my first.
Yeah, I managed to pilfer something off the cab ones when we were working on Judge Dredd because they were being worked on the design studio next door. So I had a number plate from one of the cab one vehicles sat on my desk at work. Don't think I was really supposed to have it, but hey, it looked good.
For me, it was probably the Crate Dragon bone pieces from Tunisia, which is probably more set dressing than prop, but that was one of the first things I stumbled onto.
that would actually be the same for myself. I think the very first prop I got was a set of dog tags from the classic Starship Troopers, 1997 film, but the first Star Wars piece was Crate Dragon bones in Tunisia.
And for me, it was actually somebody who was a contractor working for my parents at the time. He was a chippy, a carpenter. And he'd worked on Batman, and he had a Gotham City street sign, and he was just like, you into this? You know, he saw all the toys that I had, and I was like, yeah, definitely, I'll have it. And that was it. I was hooked.
And, you know, here's an interesting point, because you said, oh, that's more set dressing. But really, when we say props and wardrobe, it's pretty broad. It really encompasses anything used in the production of the film. It's artwork, it's sketches, it's scripts, it's concept designs, maquettes, and then screen-used props, backup props, costumes, set dressing, big pieces of the sets. We really props is just sort of the catch-all for all of that, isn't it?
I agree with you. I mean, I think I like to use the terms broadly. I think there are some sticklers that get really narrow about, like, that's actually set dressing, not a prop. And like, yeah, it is, what do you want to call it? But I agree with you. I think it's just easier than saying I collect prop, set dressing, miniatures, costumes, accessories, prosthetics,
beards,
clapperboards, call sheets. You know,
The pack of gum that you find in the pocket when you get the costume from the movie, and you're like, oh man, the actor didn't eat this gum.
Just so everyone knows, we do have some slides flashing on the screen right now. They're just going to be random props, different pieces that have been sold in the past or that are in some of our collections up here. If anybody has a question on those specific pieces, feel free to raise your hand and call it out. If not, they're just going to circle back there as visual eye candy. And with the catalogs, if you want to just come up at the end, and anybody who asks a question, what do you want to have?
Yeah, if you've
Yeah,
got a
just
question,
kind of hand them out as you go. And
Okay,
you're next
just
there,
come up
buddy.
after you ask
Sorry.
your questions. We'll get your
can we
catalog.
get your catalog?
I was just going to ask if any of you ever met the individuals behind the props or have used the props, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, quite a bit, to be honest. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of the things that are in private collections today have originated with people who worked on the films. So, I personally have spent a lot of time sending letters and reaching out to people, trying to meet different people that worked on the Star Wars films. And I think, all of us up here have at various times met key people. Good story.
I think it's where some of the great stories come from as well. It's the fascinating part of collecting. And we'll talk a little bit more about this piece in a little while and the journey that's come on. And that's a key example of, the benefits of trying to engage with these individuals as well. And it's often where the treasure's buried. So you get to that source, and those guys have not only got the piece, but got the history and the story behind it as well.
Is there a difference? He had asked like some of the people who've used it. I feel like with us, it always seems like we gravitate towards the people that made it. Rather than, the actor that had it in their hands for a little while. I feel like the real story is the behind-the-scenes guys. And when those guys are your heroes, it's kind of like the usual, never meet your heroes. I feel like it's always meet your heroes with the people we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Just earlier today, they had one of the original operators of the Yoda puppet from The Empire Strikes Back give a demonstration at their booth.
Did any of you see that when Nick Maley had Yoda going? Did any of you guys see it today?
That was great.
That guy. Okay, we got a couple.
If you want to see that, it's going to be streamed online. If you guys go to the propstore.com website, I'm sure via their social media, you'll be able to see Nick playing with the Yoda puppet that he's built.
It's pretty cool.
For all of you, was there any kind of like dangerous length that you went to get a prop?
Oh, yes. We nearly died in Finse in Norway. I'll tell you a quick story. Some of you may have heard it. But myself and Stephen and Brandon went out to Finse in Norway, where they filmed The Empire Strikes Back, the Hoth scenes. And it turned out we arrived there via the Alpine Express, the train, at about 9-10 o'clock at night, where it's pitch black. And the train just pulls up in Finse, where there's no station, and everyone's getting off the train in Arctic survival gear, with full ski wear, with mask, with breathing equipment. And there's Steve and Brandon and I who jump off the train in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. And at that point, Brandon turns to me and goes, "We are going to die."
Did he do it like Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom?
Hi. I think my son, Tim Sykes, has a Vogon from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxies from Tom Spina. But my question's for all of you. Everybody in the last panel had their Grail moment, and you guys talked about your favorite pieces. So what was your regret piece? What was the one that got away from you?
Do you want a list?
Yeah, exactly.
I think if I say first off, one of the pieces I let go is a TIE pilot helmet, which was doing the rounds in some small fairs back in England, back in probably the late 80s, early 90s. And any one of us in England could have had it for probably less than $2,000, which, as you guys know, one went through auction recently, which did, $250,000? So, yeah, there's a little bit of a regret there.
Yeah, I mean, outside of the financial side of things, I think for me, I had Hicks's complete Colonial Marine outfit in my hands. Just by chance, a friend of a friend basically went to the original auction that took place in the UK in the late 80s, I think it was. And I bought it from him for £950 and I sold it for £1,000. And that was, and it's not just the fact that, the monetary element of it, it's just the fact it was the complete costume at that time. And it got split up at that point, and then the fatigues went one way, the helmet went somewhere else, and it will never come back together again, and that's just quite sad.
Do you know, actually, just quickly picking up on that point, there is one piece that I missed on that I regret because it got destroyed afterwards. It was when we were at the Star Trek auction, and I guess a lot of you are Star Trek fans, but one of the costumes that went through was Bibi Besh's, Carol Marcus's from Star Trek 2. And I'd bid on it fairly heavily. I've got one of her costumes, wanted the other one, and I kind of backed off, and it was, I think, Rittenhouse who ended up with it. And the next time I saw it, it was chopped into pieces on trading cards, which is just sad.
Yeah.
So that's one I regret as well, just because I could have rescued that costume.
Tom, any regrets? No regrets.
I live
You've had
a
a few.
free life, Brandon. I have some. We all have some, but
I
nothing interesting.
had from Raiders of the Lost Ark one of the original golden idols, and there's a lot of castings out there, but this was an absolutely genuine one. Came from someone who worked on the film in Hawaii, and it had the baby doll eyes in it. The only other one with the baby doll eyes is the one in George Lucas's collection with the removable backplate, and I let that one go. So bit of a regret on that, but there's
that
always
went
another
to
piece
a
in
really
collecting.
good home, though, too.
Yeah, they always do.
I mean, and I'll say on regrets that one thing it tells you a little bit about an aspect of prop collecting I think a lot of people don't realize is prop collecting is unlike other categories. In many other categories of collecting, people are buying quantities of things at a regular interval. And in prop collecting, a lot of times people are buying a couple pieces a year. And actually, many times to fund those couple pieces, they're selling a piece to get it. And so it is an area where people are prone to have regrets because they give up a piece to get another piece. So they might have a regret about an individual piece, but on the balance, they're still kind of coming out ahead over time. So while we might have individual regrets, you say, well, over the years, it's actually worked out kind of okay. I'll give you just one example of a quick regret case I had. So there was an auction, it was actually a prop store auction, where a TIE Pilot helmet came up for sale. And it had been years since one had been up for auction, and it was one of those I really wanted to have a TIE Pilot helmet. And I was like determined to bid this thing up into the stratosphere if it took that to win this thing. And it went way beyond what I wanted to spend. I was like, oh, I felt painful. I even went beyond my initial mark of what I wanted to spend. But I got outbid and I was the underbidder. And then the seller decided like 2 years later to start shopping it around. And then he put it up for auction, and the person who won it in that auction put it up for auction in another auction house. And I bought it for less than he paid for it 2 years later. So sometimes you miss out on a thing, but it comes around again, and that happens sometimes.
And you actually brought up something about selling a piece. The one that just came to mind that I regret, it was a mask that you now own, but I moved that to bring in a piece that's super special to me, so I didn't even think of it as a regret.
So for those of you that collect a lot of prop weapons, do you have a specific favorite, specifically from Star Wars, and why?
Ooh, yes.
Yep. Darth Vader's hero lightsaber from Empire Strikes Back. The end.
Go on.
Yeah.
It's one that's quite dear to my heart because it came from Stephen. It's kind of one of the first big props that Stephen had, and one of the first big props that I had, and it was a Rebel blaster from the opening scenes of A New Hope. And that had come over to the UK for use in a magazine feature, and had stayed within the UK. And Stephen bought it, and it was his first kind of big purchase. And then I purchased it off of Stephen, and I still have it, and he'll never let me forget it.
I love that it's still in the family like that, though.
He gets visitation rights.
For me, I collect Star Wars Cantina stuff. Most of my pieces are from that one scene. Bit of a focus collector because, honestly, with props, you can't have it all. There is no completist for props. So, and I've got Walrus Man's blaster. And what's really cool is there are behind-the-scenes photos that the BAPTI, the company that made all of the blasters for the movie, had that you can see the serial number on, and it matches the gun. So it's just one of those really good matches. It's, they talk about a screen match where it's something matches the screen where there's a flaw or a scratch or something, but this is a lot of times I think we'll take a behind-the-scenes photo match over a screen match anytime because it's just so definitive, so clear.
Is there a favorite prop that you have out of all your props in your collection?
Well, I'll carry on. Similar to the prop weapons question, favorite for me, I have one of Luke's hero lightsabers from Return of the Jedi, which is screen matched and photo matched. So that's a big favorite for me.
I find my favorite, a lot of times, it's impossible to pick a favorite, and so many times it's the most recent pickup. Like I picked up from Andy recently. It's now my recent favorite, General Madine's beard.
I love General Madine's beard.
I just love for the
beard.
His beard from Return of the Jedi is so awesome. So
I love that Stuart Freeborn kept that. Like somewhere after the movie, he's like, we might need that again. Put that in a box.
With his name on as well.
Did you guys, I don't know if you guys have heard us before tell you the story about the Medine beard. We'll tell you it quickly, but I guess a lot of you guys are into the toys and things like that. And Dermot Crowley, the guy who played General Medine in Return of the Jedi, when he turned up for costume fitting and photos and things like that in the production, he had a beard because he's a Shakespearean actor, so he had a full beard. And then when he turns up for filming, he's actually shaved it off because he only had it for the Shakespearean play. And they'd actually already tooled up for the Kenner action figure. So you've got all these guys screaming like, well, we've got tooled up for this action figure. So Stuart Freeborn, who was the makeup effects guy, had to rush down to Wig Specialities in London, get a beard made up for Dermot, get it fitted within the same day or so. And that's why it looks so terrible.
How many people knew, and I know it's going to throw off the question, but how many people knew that General Madine was wearing a fake beard?
everyone in the
not
world.
a lot, right? No, I'm surprised because go look at it again. Go watch Return of the Jedi. I know it's a big ask, but watch Return of the Jedi, and then you'll see. You'll be like, how did we never notice this?
Is there a piece that you remember that was extraordinarily difficult to track down? And if you could elaborate what Brexit means to the European Union. Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on that.
I think, yeah, no, to be honest with you, I mean, so many of them are really hard to track down, and sometimes you don't even know what journey that you're on and what might come up at the end of that journey. You know, as Gus said, you know, what's your favorite piece? It's the next thing that you discover and where it lies, and you know, who would have known that this piece would surface and be with us here today, and similarly for so many of the other items that are just buried and sometimes lost forever, or thought lost forever.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask my own question because you already gave me one of the books, so I feel I owe you. Talk about the process of authentication when someone brings you a prop. What are the different ways you try to authenticate that prop? Are there ever times where you can never really quite be sure, or are you always able to kind of figure it out one way or the other?
I think that's a great question, actually, and maybe a case in point. I don't want to refer too much back to the prop store booth, but if you haven't been there, we have a Luke Skywalker, A New Hope lightsaber sitting there, and if you haven't seen it, it's phenomenal. You should go and have a look at it. And we've been through an extensive research process on that, which it has great provenance. The saber itself actually originated with the guy who ran Elstree Studios, had a son who was the right age at the time to be a fan, and he found this lightsaber there. When you look at the lightsaber, it has all the blue marks where the grip strips were adhered to it. It has the D-ring that's fitted to the underside of it. It has the bubble strip on the side of the clamp as well. But then it has this sort of anomalous plate that's been welded at the top of the saber, which we're surmising was part of the prototyping process for the spinning saber blade, so the mechanical version. But in welding it on there, it looks like it's actually damaged the top of it. So we know that the chain of provenance is really strong. You know, it's got a great backstory to it. All the detailing on it is absolutely right. What we can't be 100% certain about is how much screen time that piece actually got, and whether that damage occurred before filming or after filming, but it was dressed and they're ready to go. So, you know, we would love to say at that point, look, everything about this is right except for this one little plate and this damage on there. Is this the one that was filmed on? We can't be sure, so we can only go as far as using all of that information and saying, okay, it was made for production. We haven't seen anything like this before. This is an astounding item, but we can't guarantee that it's absolutely used for filming.
I think it's very analogous to antiques dealers in that there's no one answer where you can say, well, you look for that and it's authentic. It's just a process of experience, of tracking down history, of no intel. So there is no one answer, but you look at any good long-term antique dealer and they've developed this network of how they find things out, things to look for, and it's just like that. It's a mystery trail which we unwind with each piece.
Yeah, I would say outside of screen matching, which Stephen was describing, where you can see something on the screen and you can look at the scratches and paint marks and so on and prove that, yes, I own this item that was actually used in this scene. I would argue that most other means of authenticating are probabilistic to some degree. Like, in some sense, and there's been discussion over the years in communities of prop collectors where people say, well, actually, unless you're on the set seeing them film that piece, and they hand you that piece right after that scene, and that scene gets used in the movie, do you really have proof that this thing was used in this movie? And it's not to say, oh, well, we should now be discouraged and we can't own things that we have high confidence we're using in the movies. The way we all go about it is you triangulate. Like, you use a lot of different approaches. You get documentation. For example, if you know 3 were made from the film because there's a document that says 3 were made and we can account for all 3, and you know which one is more weathered and is closest to the ones you see on screen, that might provide one piece. Another might be reputation of the person who finds it. Another might be just the consistency with things you see on screen. Like, there's a lot of different methods, and I think the more you apply these methods, the more you have high confidence this is something was used in the movie. But to some degree, there's always that little bit of probability that unless it's screen matched, it's possible that it isn't the one used in that film.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're always very careful that, we're collecting production artifacts ultimately. These are things that we are very, very highly confident they are made for production. They're custom built or modified in whatever capacity or rented in for filming, but it's part of the production process. And unless you get a screen match, that's really as far as you can take it in most instances.
And there's some cases where it's obvious they only made one, although that's rare. A lot of items they make multiples of, but there are some things that are just too expensive for them to made more than one. So sometimes that might give confidence.
Such as Jabba the Hutt, whose tail is on the screen at the moment.
And something that really goes hand in hand with authenticity is the chain of ownership. That's always part of the discussion. Sometimes it's known, sometimes it isn't. But another big question that people always ask us is, well, where do these things come from? How did they get out there? What is the process by which they go into private hands? And so we did want to talk a little bit about that today. And we have a guest with us who we're going to bring up. His name is John Holt. He's sitting right here in the front row. John, if you want to come up. So John is actually the owner of the Stormtrooper helmet that is sitting here on the table. And John has consigned it with us with Prop Store. It's going to be sold at an auction later this year. It's been downstairs all show at the Prop Store booth if you'd like to see it. But we thought it would be really interesting for John to tell the story of how this thing came to be in his hands, because it's a fascinating, slightly wild story.
Well, thank you so much, Brandon, and thanks for having me here. So it's sort of interesting collecting. I mean, from my opinion, there's kind of two ways. There's like these gentlemen did, and I'm sure a lot of you out there do, is sort of scour the earth and have a lifetime of collecting. And the other one is just absolute dumb luck. And I'm the latter. By chance, in 1978, on October 15th, my aunt and uncle in the UK had a Star Wars party. And they had the capacity to actually have most of the cast and crew of Star Wars to their home. They also brought along a lot of the props, and they had a Star Wars party. I have no idea how or why, but that's what they did. So I knew about this. I was about 14 years old. I wasn't there, but I'd heard about this. And every time I would go and visit my aunt and uncle, I would see this helmet at the end of the table in their laundry room. They kept it there. My aunt kept it there. Eventually, my uncle died. My aunt kept it there for 40 years in her laundry room. And so, of course, when we were kids, we would visit the UK and run around the house and wearing the helmet. And I knew that it was from the first film, but I had assumed that several thousand were made. So I knew that there was probably some value to it, but there came a time where my aunt had to be put into a home, and we had to clear out her house. And I'd fallen in love particularly with a little trophy that my grandmother had won in the 1920s. And I needed to take it home, and the only thing that I could find that would fit inside and was hard enough to protect that was this helmet. So I wrapped it in a tea towel, and I put the trophy inside. I put the helmet in a plastic bag, and I flew back to Canada. I had to cram the helmet into the overhead bin, and you'll notice there's some paint missing on a little bit on the top of the head as I crammed it in the overhead bin. And I knew prior to that in fact it was a little too large for the overhead bin. And I was prepared for, if that was the case, my sister's joke that I should wear it on the airplane. But the real decision was that I would just throw it away at Heathrow if, in fact, I couldn't get it on the plane. Because, as I said, I knew it had a tiny bit of value, but I couldn't ever guess really how important it was. I did see Star Wars when I was 14 years old, and I didn't particularly like it. So I haven't been a Star Wars fan. But anyway, having said that, when Carrie Fisher died, of course there was an enormous outpouring, and I thought to myself, well, I have all of these pictures, a lot of them you're seeing on the screen now, of Carrie Fisher when she was at my aunt's house. And I thought to myself, well, I wonder, I guess I should share some of these photos with others, and I should talk about this. And it was at that point that I started to look at the helmet a little more seriously, and I got online, and I realized it was quite a rare find. So I eventually Google searched who should know about this, and came up with Brandon. and went down to see Brandon. And I watched CSI, and I had all of these ways I was going to prove the authenticity of this helmet. They were never finished inside. There were a lot of rough edges, and I knew there was some DNA from some of the actors who might have worn it. There's still some gaff tape in the top, and there was some hair there, and I was darn sure that I was going to. And of course, they were all hand painted. And this particular one was right after it was painted. Somebody took it looks like their thumbprint and made an absolute perfect thumbprint in the paint. So I was armed with all this to go see Brandon, and when I arrived in Los Angeles and was starting to explain my DNA theories, he quickly said, well, look at this. And he pulled up this photo of a screenshot. I had no idea that television was movie film was that accurate at that time, but Brandon pulled it up, and we saw at least 20 different things on that helmet, like a paint drip here, a scratch there, a miscut tooth here, that showed that helmet was absolutely a screen-used helmet.
Yeah, and so this slide right here is illustrating the screen match. And when you have it in hand, there are more points that you can see in person of exactly how we know that it is that helmet. But it's the one on the far right of this shot of Leia on the Tantive 4 and the opening of Star Wars. This was one of the last sequences shot for the movie, so the gear was fairly banged up by that time. You can see the guy on the left has got a piece of white gaffer's tape on the inside of his bicep. And, you know, this helmet has various scratches on it. It's got this big drip in the paint here that we've illustrated with the red arrow. And you know, that and some of the other marks, when you look at it, it's just every nuance to it is exactly the same, and it is that helmet. And essentially, it was used for filming, you know, which finished up at about 76, and then they went to do this event in 78. They pulled some props out of storage. They took at least 4 stormtroopers out there, complete costumes, and they left one of the helmets with your aunt.
Correct. Yes, and what's so funny is that when I first contacted Brandon, of course, he was a little bit suspicious. And I sent him a photo of my aunt's party, and he said to me, I have photos of your aunt's party. And I said, well, how's that possible? And he said, because I have a file of photos I can't identify, and I guarantee you I have photos of your aunt's party. And he sent me photos of my aunt's party.
It's a small world.
And you've done a lot of research on this event, and you went through and you interviewed different people who lived in the town. And
I did. I went back to the town. Now these are horsey people, so I went back to the town. And I asked, I'd walk into the pub and I'd ask who the oldest was in the pub. And invariably someone would point to the oldest fellow. And I had a shot that was up earlier of Carrie Fisher handing out the badges. And I sort of said, these are all people from the village. Do you remember the Star Wars party that happened in 1978? The village is only 400 people. Nobody in that village remembered. Nobody. Except I went to the media, I asked the media, they didn't know anything about it. Somebody then photocopied my photo and put it in the mailboxes all around the village. And the people who were the little kids then came out of the woodwork. And they started to email me, and they said, I was there. I met Darth Vader when I was 6 years old. Everyone tells me I'm lying, but I was there.
And just looking at this for a second, you talked about all the research you had done in the DNA and everything you were going to do to prove this to Brandon. I have to imagine, knowing how many of these you've seen and handled in person, he shows this to you, you don't even go like, oh, maybe that's not, like, you're just like, yeah, that's real.
Yeah, it was actually as soon as I got the photograph. It was just, yeah, there are certain things, obviously there's a lot of replicas out there, there's a lot of replica helmets specifically, but, you know, when you've handled and worked with these assets, there's just a quality to them that they have and that they express, and that you can really see with this piece. In particular, the texture, you know, and the fact that it's made out of the gray plastic. Most of the helmets for the first film, Star Wars, they did about 50 helmets. They were made out of a gray plastic because it was easier to vac form than a white ABS. So this is a relatively cheap, inexpensive plastic, and then it's painted just, you know, pretty quick and dirty with basic latex paint. And so they have a certain characteristic that the replicas never quite capture.
It's more a lack of quality, and you get that when people see this in person. People don't realize how poorly these things are made, because they're only made to last for a few weeks and to be seen for a few seconds, and the production companies want to spend the least amount of money possible. So people were looking at this over the weekend and just saying, oh, we can't believe how rough it looks. But looking at the screen match still that you saw just now, you can see when you look at it in detail, all these lumps, bumps, cracks, dents, runs of paint, they're absolutely there.
They never even notice General
Exactly,
Madine's
yeah.
beard. They're not going to notice lumps on the helmet.
It's the magic of the movies.
But one thing that's really significant about this also is based on its specific history, the fact that it was used for filming in '76 and then in '78 it remained with John's aunt at this party. It never went back for The Empire Strikes Back. All the helmets that they still had around for Empire were actually repainted, and the frown, specifically the color on the teeth, went from the gray color that you see here in Star Wars to a black. So in Empire, they're the same helmets from Star Wars, but with a black frown. This one, because it departed before Empire, it's got that gray frown, and it's essentially been preserved in its first movie condition, which is pretty cool.
John, I think that's an amazing story, man. Big round of applause for him.
Hi, my name is Ricardo. This is my first celebration and information about original movie props. For a newcomer, how can someone start to collect movie props? Can you give me like any recommendations or information about it? Thank you.
First off, congratulations on your first celebration. Is your mind blown?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I thought it might be.
I came here from Panama, so those of the very first time in the States. I'm very nervous right now.
Cool. That's fine. The easiest way to start is to come to our booth and buy something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can come down and chat with us at Prop Store. We do have some things that are for sale here today at the show. There are also various online resources that you can look up. Gus's website is a great source of information. The Star Wars Collectors Archive. There are some discussion forums, and there are some groups on Facebook, on social media specifically, where people are talking about original movie props and costumes, and you can get on there and see what other collectors are saying and are doing.
And you want to do your research, that's really vitally important. It's very easy to, what we call, or coin the phrase, want to believe. You can go on eBay and you can probably see something that purports to be something phenomenal for, a few $100s or low thousands. Really dig deep on that. Go onto these forums, ask around, get involved, start chatting with some of the long-term collectors who've been around for a while, and just ensure that it is actually what it purports to be. Because if you don't buy something with a certificate of authenticity, then you'll end up with something ultimately that you can do nothing with if you've bought something that really isn't right. So be very careful, take your time, don't jump in. And I think, often people say, if I've got £500 or I've got $500, I'm better going and buying a couple of small props, or, how should I do this? And I think, first of all, buy with your heart. You want to buy something that you love, that you're going to enjoy. Buy it because you want to own it. Don't think about the monetary value. But if you have got a budget, try and spend at the upper element of your budget, because you're likely to buy something that's maybe a little bit more significant. And if you are thinking about sort of the investment side of things and the potential for the future, if you love it and it's something that is recognizable or more recognizable, it means that the next person might like it as well.
Yeah, if it looks too good to be true, it usually is, unless it comes from John.
And one thing, a lot of times when we do these panels and we show a lot of prop pieces that are, really, iconic and easily recognizable, there's a huge range. So, there are price points in the low hundreds, and then there are extreme examples in the hundreds of thousands, even a couple that have crested $1 million. And a lot of the ones that are very expensive get all the press disproportionately, and those are actually kind of rare and few. The vast majority of props that get sold are at that lower end of that range, and so that's one thing to be aware of. Is actually it doesn't have to be super expensive. And the other thing is that the others mentioned is don't rush into anything. There is actually quite a lot out there, and there are times in collecting where one should hustle. And you need to move fast and strike fast, and if you don't strike fast, you lose that opportunity. But I find that, in my experience in collecting a lot of areas, you want to be well informed before you get to that point where you are hustling to strike, because if you do it too naively before you're really ramped in an area, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and you're going to get convinced by someone wanting to sell that there's urgency, and there actually isn't urgency. There's a lot of stuff out there, and a lot of collectors sell to other collectors, and it's not like it's all going to freeze and be gone. There will still be stuff in circulation. So those would be my tips.
My question is, I see some of these are pretty big. Have you guys had to do anything to your house, like remodel, blow out walls,
Take the
upgrade
roof
your
off.
house just to support it?
Yeah, yes. So we had to constantly do things in our house. So the first thing was, first phase of it was, as I was starting to get more into prop collecting, the stuff takes up space, massive amounts of space. And in my style of, I love displaying stuff. And I actually have very little of my collection packed away in boxes. Most things I own, I have on display in some form or another. And so as I started to collect props, it was like a huge demand on the space in our house. And so what it ended up doing is forcing us to build an extension to the house. So we built another building in the back, and that created 6 more collectibles rooms, and we moved some of the non-prop stuff out there. We actually moved some prop stuff out there, and then had more rooms in the house, and occupied also the living room, the dining room, the foyer, and parts of the basement with props, and then some dedicated rooms on the second floor with props. So we had lots of space for props. And then I was going down an angle of saying, well, these are all significant pieces, so they all deserve, if it's a flat piece, it deserves to be framed. If it's a costume piece, it should be on a mannequin in its own acrylic display case. If it's like a significant prop, it should be on its own stand in its own display case. And it seems right. That's what a museum would do. But you get to a place where you run out of space with that, and that was like, okay, what do I do? And so recently, I started to reinvent it and going, okay, what I need to do and some of it was inspired by Steven's collection, seeing how he displays some things, which is start to group things. So I have now this massive display case I had custom built that is just masks and hats and helmets. And then I put all the blasters together, and then I put all the costumes in one room with a couple big display cases, but a whole bunch of mannequins can fit in it. And so, ironically, by condensing it this way, not only did it free up space, but actually looks more impressive when I started to sort of aggregate them by type of collectible. So now this like rack of blasters and this wall of masks and this just rows of costumes, it looks more impressive than when they were scattered all over the house.
That is an extreme case, or that's not the norm.
Right.
Yeah, I think most
bring him
people,
a soda before, so I think she's still around.
Most collectors have some sort of display space, and for a lot of us, it's about displaying things in our office or a home theater environment, something like that. A lot of the fun of getting these things is figuring out how you're going to put them on display and how you're going to set them up, and then sort of taking a moment to step back and just admire them. So, Gus, obviously, with the house extension, a bit of an extreme example, but I think everyone is trying to display things, around their home.
There is a
or their
real
office
easy
in a nice
answer.
way.
It's just, Gus, just give everything to me, and then your house will be clear.
Sounds good. Prop Brexit.
Alrighty, so I'm an archivist with the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I'm seeing a lot of these props, and they look old, and as you said with the Stormtrooper helmet, they're very beat up. And I'm curious at how you preserve them so that they don't degrade or erode or have any number of damages caused to them over the years.
It's a great question, and Tom and myself are kind of experts on this field. Obviously, Tom does the restorations. Part of a division of my company is based on laser framing and display work and custom mannequins and things like that. So the both of us, it's something very close to our heart. Yeah. And we do believe that preservation and proper presentation and caring for these things is a huge part of it. And there's many, many ways we go around it. Things like using UV protective materials, making sure they're supported fully. Tom does a lot on latex.
Yeah, support is key to almost anything. And whether it's a costume where you just want it to drape right, so you're doing a custom mannequin, if it's a complicated costume or a creature suit, you've got to do something completely different in order to make sure that basically gravity can't have its way with it. When it's latex pieces, there's all sorts of things that my company's developed at Tom Spina Designs doing really, really specialized latex care, foam latex care, polyfoam, and trying to do whatever we can to keep these creatures around. A lot of it just comes down to how you're going to display these pieces and managing things like exposure to UV, exposure to light, exposure to heat, which can be a real killer, and obviously high or too low humidity.
Also handling as well.
Keeping your handles off it. But it's sort of an all-encompassing thing. You get this piece in, you figure out how it's going to fit into your display, you decide if it needs special care or if it's something you can put on a shelf, and then you bring in somebody like Andy or myself to come up with a plan for you for that specific piece, and it really is different every time. It's one of the things that makes our job so challenging.
Every piece is bespoke. Everything has to be approached differently. There's quite a good book if you're interested in it. It's a Smithsonian book called Saving Stuff.
Yes, love it.
And it will give you a really good insight into how
It's a good
museum
primer.
curators look after their pieces. So if you have got some decent pieces, I recommend getting that book.
Okay, I'm going to throw another question out there. Props get repurposed all the time, particularly back in the day of more low-budget productions. It happened on Star Trek a lot. I was a big Star Trek fan, and I noticed, hey, that looks a lot like Nomad.
So he was going to say, are there any Star Wars props like that?
So talk about a time you came across a prop that had been repurposed from something else, and do you sell it as, it was this, and it was repurposed to this, or how that falls into your research and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that happens on all kinds of movies. It certainly happened throughout the 3 Star Wars films. So here's an item on the screen right here. Good timing. This lightsaber began its life as the Alec Guinness dueling lightsaber, so the one that actually had a blade on it that he would use to duel with David Prowse in the first film. And it actually had a little motor in the handle, and the blade spun. There was a power wire going up the sleeve of the costume, which you can see if you watch the movie. And it was used for the fight sequence with Vader. When they got to Return of the Jedi, obviously Luke had lost his hand at the end of Empire, and so the Star Wars and Empire style saber that's based on the Graflex Flash, that was gone. They needed something new. And so what did they do? They basically went to the prop box, pulled out the one that used to be Alec Guinness's, and said, well, this is Luke's now. They changed a few things to it. They put the little computer edge card there in the clamp, but essentially it was used as is. And so it basically has a dual identity, or as Tom Spina used to call it, a twofer, where it's been used in 2 different roles throughout the production, which is just really neat and part of the history of it.
It's a great one as well with Star Wars, because obviously a lot of these pieces, people mistakenly assume that they're owned by Lucasfilm or Disney nowadays, whereas a lot of it is just rental. It comes from rental houses, and the Stormtrooper blasters came from an armory rental house, and they were actually reused in an English TV comedy program called The Two Ronnies. There's a little sketch in it called The Worm That Turned, and it's basically that women take over the world and subjugate men. And there's one scene where a bunch of scantily clad women jump out the back of a Ford Transit van, and they're all armed with Stormtrooper blasters.
And you were only watching it for the props.
I was only looking for the Star Wars
research, man. Research.
Yeah, research.
Other examples, actually the Rebel pilot helmets, also on the screen, the ones they made for A New Hope, they revamped them for Empire Strikes Back. They changed the decals, they added lining on the inside, they changed the lens. So there are things like that they did in the Star Wars movies. Another example we talked about also was the Crate Dragon skeleton we talked about earlier. That was that fiberglass skeleton that served as the Crate Dragon on the Dune Sea and Star Wars was actually from a Disney film. One of our dinosaurs is missing. They built this full fiberglass skeleton of a dinosaur for that movie, and that's what they, instead of building a brand new Crate Dragon skeleton, that's what they used for Star Wars.
Yeah, one of their dinosaurs really is missing. I've got a bit, he's got a bit, he's got a bit.
Yes, there was if you started your collecting in your early years, being able to go on sets or scavenge from places for props, did you find that there's ever been a lull because of the time period where everything has become digitalized for a while there in the 90s and early 2000s, that it was kind of harder to find things?
I don't think so much about the digitization and the sort of digital effects and things like that. Certainly when that was coming in, that was a big concern for us as collectors, because there was a sort of assumption that suddenly, everybody was going to be in green suits with green rods that were props and green screen. And of course, we saw a lot of that on the Phantom Menace as the technology was changing. But I think what's really changed more than that and had a greater impact is actually asset management. So when films are made today, it's no longer considered, this is just a byproduct at this point of the filmmaking process. For a production company, The product is what ends up in the can. It's the film that they're making or the TV show that they're making. And so a lot of these things would have been discarded, given away like this helmet, or rented, as Andy was saying earlier. And that's changed so much since there's been this understanding and acceptance of not only their monetary value, but also their historic and cultural significance to sort of future generations and people who are going to be interested in this as the years move on. The studios and production companies asset manage everything. So somebody goes on set, and that is their job, to barcode these things, to track them, to monitor them, understand how they're moving through the production process. And then when it comes to the end of that, they'll make a decision that's at a very high level. So previously, the prop guys might go, you know what, we're going to get rid of all this stuff, let's have a prop sale. Everybody works in the prop department, come on down, you know, you can buy this stuff for a couple of quid. Now it's going to be, you know, the senior studio executive will say, right, this proportion is going out to marketing, this proportion is going into the archive, we don't want to resell anything else, so we're going to destroy it. I mean, that happens a great deal. Or it's just going to be locked away. And so today, for a lot of modern contemporary films and TV shows, it's about building relationships with the studios and becoming partners with the production companies so that you get it at that sort of top of the chain where that decision making's been decision is being made, and then filtering it out from there. So that's the difference. You know, I used to spend years going through rental houses, going to prop houses, going to special effects guys. And if you do that now, they just don't have anything. You know, it's just that the business has changed of actually making movies so much that opportunity is gone.
Okay, just a little reminder, we have about 8 minutes left, so talk fast.
You mentioned about doing research and getting an item authenticated. Have any of you ever purchased an item only to discover later it was a fake?
Yes. But don't talk to us about it because we're still bitter.
I think almost every prop collector at some stage in
That's for me. Sorry.
That's Lucasfilm. They want all their props back.
That's right. We're not here.
Almost every prop collector, I think, has at some point stumbled onto something that they then found out was not original. And this is why we give lots of advice about take your time and research it, because we've learned from our own mistakes that it's you know, especially as these things get higher price points, the temptation to make fake stuff goes up. You know, like when I collect you know, $10 Star Wars food items, the stuff isn't generally faked because it's only $10. But you know, with movie props, it is something where there's a lot of temptation, and actually, it's also harder to prove its consistency with other things, and so it's easier for someone to argue this is an original item. So yeah, I mean, every prop collector I know pretty much has at some point or another stumbled onto something that they either thought was fake or that they have significant doubts about.
So many props nowadays can be 3D printed, and you know, companies are trying to use more cost-effective ways in terms of the ships and stuff. We saw a lot of stuff with Mandalorian today. They were 3D printed as opposed to being resin cast or something like that. So do you think that, considering the different ways that they were made, that maybe some of these props won't last as long, or you know, might not be as worth it if they are deteriorating quicker?
Well, I think it's just a new set of concerns, really, and you know, the goal with film props and costumes and creature effects pieces, they've always been designed for one purpose, and that's to get the image in the can. You know, they're not designed to last as collectibles. They're not designed to be sold in the way a consumer products item would, and would have to, you know, meet certain quality control standards and that sort of thing. So there could be some concerns there, but at the same time, there are concerns with the foam, latex, and rubber materials of yesteryear. And there's people like Tom Spina that have gone in and figured out how to stabilize those materials. And it's really just all part of the game. You know, you've got to consider that, and you've got to consider what the item is, what it's made out of, how you're going to care for it. Is there any potential for breakdown? You know, most things, if they're kept in ideal conditions or something close to ideal conditions, will do okay over the years. The Ewok that's sitting here was made for Return of the Jedi in 1982, so that's 37 years ago. And it's about as good today as it was when it was made. You know, the foam latex is still very soft and supple. It's been stored away in a box for many years, out of the light, and it's in good shape. And I think if it continues to be well looked after, it will continue to last. And I would expect, you know, it's generally the same with 3D printed props as well.
Yeah, just going with 3D printing, because I worked with stereolithography and deposition modeling back in the 80s. So a lot of guys are like, oh, 3D printing's a new thing. We were using this through the 70s and 80s, and I have pieces I did in the automotive industry, and they look as good as the day they come off the bed of the machine in 89 and 90. So I think we're on a pretty safe wicket.
Yeah, I mean, I hear some concerns about 3D printing with the idea that, oh, well, somebody who's working on the film can just crank out 3 extras of something, and there is some concern about that, actually. But 3D printing, I don't think, changes it that much. Resin
Like you
casting
could
is
always
pretty easy
cast
too.
extra resin
Like, it's
pieces,
not like
anything
3D
to rubber
printing,
pieces.
and a lot goes into the painting of the thing too. Like
Yeah.
even at those 3D printed, like if you look at these new props, like there's immense detail that goes into the painting of it, and that is hard
how
to
they're
make.
finished, how they're sanded, how they're detailed. Yep.
Is it harder to get your hands on a newer item from a new movie or an old one, and why is that so?
Well, I think it depends on what item you're looking for, but in general, with the Star Wars films specifically, I would say there's a lot more content out there from the older films. There's really only been a few pieces that have been released from the newest films. Lucasfilm has put some items out for charity auctions. There's a few Stormtrooper helmets that have gone out for sale from The Force Awakens and possibly The Last Jedi as well. At one point, one of Harrison Ford's jackets from The Force Awakens was put up for auction, but you can probably count the number of pieces that they've put out there for charity auction on 2 hands and maybe 1 hand, whereas when you talk about original trilogy stuff, we've just had an hour of slideshow of things flicking by, so there's dozens and dozens, if not in the hundreds of total pieces out there.
Yeah, it's just back in the day, these pieces were discarded, whereas nowadays the production companies are switched on and they keep them, and this is an active franchise where they want to reuse these things or reference them. So the pieces tend to be out there from the original trilogy because they were discarded, because nobody wanted them back in the day.
But there is a possibility also that, at some point, I mean, it's unlikely, but at some point, Lucasfilm may well decide to have an auction, and at that point, it will be a game-changing situation. Suddenly we might see all this material, and I mean, we really pray for that day, frankly. But
Well, kind of like the Star Trek auction back in 2006.
Sure. Yeah, there was yeah. So it may well change. It's always, these things are fluctuating as well.
Just out of interest, with the Star Trek auction there, basically, to let fill you guys in, Paramount had a disposal auction, was it 2005, I think? 2006, where they basically went in the archives and just took everything out and just sold it at an auction. And if there's a documentary called is it Crossing the Final Frontier, it's a great watch where they dispose of these assets. I recommend you watch it on YouTube. It's amazing.
So last one?
Yeah. When it comes to the transition between licensed replicas and something like hero props and weapons, I see that there is a lot of artistic liberties taken with what we are sold as official licensed replicas. And when someone like me, who likes to build lightsabers, and my research dives into the accuracy of all these items, and I find that a lot of these props don't match what we know or what we are told in any of the visual dictionaries or any of the replicas that we can buy. So my question is, why exactly does that happen so often?
I'll take this as a licensee. I mean, it's honestly, it's just down to each piece and being having to juggle a number of priorities. Accuracy is obviously one of them. Price point is obviously one of them, because if you don't hit your price point, no one's going to buy it. Dealing with the licensor, so maybe Lucasfilm has requests about a piece, or they see it differently than you see it, and it could be 2 people looking at the same blurry image. But if the company you're working for says no, this is what's right, that's maybe that's what you have to do then. Other times it's just down to manufacturing. Maybe it's a more streamlined way to manufacture it, to do something that's a little cleaner or less, less dinged up or something like that. I think for the most part, most of the licensees do strive for accuracy when they're doing replica pieces, and certainly I do.
We've also got to meet trading standards and
there's safety standards, exactly, all of that. Thank you.
Yeah. And another very, very relevant point to this is just the fact that there are always multiples. So in film production, whether Star Wars or anything else, they almost always will have multiples of a given asset. So one lightsaber may be slightly different to another lightsaber because these things are being made by hand by the prop department. If you look at the Stormtrooper helmets, the reason we can pick this one out on screen is because of the unique flaws in the paint. And so, you do have that as well. It's like, which one is the licensee copying for the replica?
We've got a Chewbacca bust, and there are numerous Chewbacca masks that were used in these films, and they look different even during the same films, the same mask, because the hair goes differently or whatever. And here's another issue, though. Guys like us who love the flaws and the weird little idiosyncrasies are not everyone. So maybe these companies are now trying to shoot to a broader audience and say, if I made a Stormtrooper helmet that looked like this, nobody's going to buy it. They're going to think it's a piece of junk. I personally think I love the piece of junk, but that's just another big consideration that they have, and that's why that sort of thing happens.
Yeah, many people who get into replica props and then compare to originals find that actually a lot of the replicas look better.
Yeah.
They're perfect, they're cleaned up. And so that's one of the big differences is they're trying to take the imperfections out and make the perfect prop. Whereas on screen, you just need it to be good enough for that shot. And sometimes the detail in it or paint marks and so on are not a concern because at the angle that they're filming it, it's not going to come out. In fact, I've had like people tour our house and then they'd say, wow, those pieces look pretty bad. And it's not an insult. It's more like they're used to seeing these replica props that are just pristine. And they're like, I'm really shocked that, blasters look this bad up close. I was like, yeah, that's what they used. They didn't need to make it perfect.
If you think Star Wars props are bad, you should look at the ones used for Flash Gordon, honestly.
And that's our next panel. Everyone is staying for the next hour as Andy talks about Flash Gordon.
Well, I could listen to this all day long, but unfortunately we are out of time. Let's give a warm applause to
Thank you all for coming.
We have flyers from the Prop Store and Tom Spina Productions and Regal Robot on that door. Star Tots will be given out at both doors, however.
Great
and
questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah,
that was
thanks
great
for
Yeah, that
questions.
was really good. Thanks for all your participation.